Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're exploring 3 stories from people who grew up and spent most of their childhood in one of the most haunted regions in the US, Appalachia. Living, and especially growing up out there, isn't for the faint of heart, and these stories are proof of that. Childhood shapes who we are, and when that childhood is marked by trauma, fear, and things most of us can't even imagine, how do you cope with that? As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. The story I'm about to share is far from resolved, and it remains one of the things that keeps me awake most nights. I tell it now in the hope that somehow, putting it into words might serve as a form of exorcism, an attempt at therapy, if only a desperate one. I don't know whether it will work, but people say that speaking our truths, or at least writing them down, can help. So this is my attempt, however flawed, to rid myself of the weight I've been carrying. I'm 24 years old, and I live in Wyoming now. But I spent the first 23 years of my life in West Virginia. I left because what happened shattered my family in a way that made it unbearable to remain anywhere near them. To give you some context, growing up, my parents were always emotionally absent. Life in these mountains isn't easy. Some people develop a kind of hardened exterior, a wall of constant labor to keep the mind busy, to avoid thinking too deeply. That's exactly who my parents were. And because of that, I grew up in a house with 2 people who, in many ways, were complete strangers to me. I've always been a socially isolated person, with no real friends and barely any family. My mom and dad were completely indifferent to me, and I think that kind of isolation really messed with me. I could go days without saying a single word to anyone. That lack of connection made me turn a blind eye to things happening right in front of me. I ignored everything my uncle did, because he was the only one who ever gave me any attention, even if it was small and selfish. My grandparents weren't ideal either. They were just as emotionally stunted as my parents, and my grandfather was a harsh man, especially when he drank. So as I said, I turned to the youngest of their children, my father's brother, my uncle. He had always been different from the rest of the family. By then he was already 42, but no one really knew what he did for a living. He spent most of his time indoors, glued to his computer screen, and in a family like ours, that made him something of an oddball. That fascinated me. I looked up to him, idolized him even, and willingly ignored all the red flags. I started spending more and more time at his place, sometimes even sleeping over. His house wasn't inside the main building. It was a large converted porch adjacent to my grandparents' home, but still spacious enough to be more comfortable than most houses. The first strange thing I remember, I must have been around 10 or 11, was waking up one night to the sound of muffled noises coming from his room. I couldn't quite make them out. I had never seen my uncle with anyone, and I was fairly certain that, like me, he didn't really have friends. So I lay there trying to listen for what felt like forever. When it became clear that I wasn't going to understand anything just lying there, I got up as quietly as I could and walked to his door. The sounds I heard were coming from what I assumed was a woman. She sounded frightened, genuinely terrified. That scared me. I leaned in closer and saw, through the partially open door, my uncle sitting at his computer, editing what looked like a video of a woman tied to a chair, duct tape over her mouth. Her expression was pure panic, so real, so visceral it froze me in place. I was overwhelmed by a sense of dread and ran back to bed. Moments later, my uncle came into the room, furious. He told me that if I was going to snoop around in the middle of the night, I wasn't welcome there anymore. I remember asking him what I'd seen, and he told me it was a police documentary. He said the woman was being investigated for crimes and had to be restrained because she was dangerous. I remember that part vividly, because I didn't even know what the word restrained meant. I nodded, pretending to understand, desperate for him not to be angry with me. Because more than anything, I didn't want him to stop liking me. Eventually, the incident faded into the background, because in the days that followed, my uncle showered me with gifts. I was happier than I'd ever been. My parents had never given me anything, not even on my birthday. Years later, after a particularly rough day at school where I'd been mocked and humiliated, I needed to talk to someone. Anyone. It was around 10 p.m., and without my parents having any idea, I slipped out the window and walked toward my uncle's place. It was about 8 minutes into my walk through the forest when I collided with a boy, a few years older than me, bleeding from a gash on his head. He was terrified, breathless, and begged me for help, saying a psychopath was after him. I froze completely. I couldn't think, couldn't speak properly. The only thing I managed to do was point toward the road and tell him to run that way. Just to give you an idea, our whole family lives in the same area. My house is about a 10-minute walk from my grandparents' and my uncle's place. There's nothing around us but woods, and the closest neighbors live farther south. But even then, it's at least a 30-minute walk. So it pretty much felt like it was all our property. Even though I pointed him to the road, I knew no one was likely to come by for hours. I stayed rooted in that spot for a long time, trying to process what had just happened, before continuing on to my uncle's. I knocked several times with no answer. I went around to the garden, retrieved the spare key from the tree where I knew he kept it. The house was silent, and he wasn't there. I figured he might have gone to the pub or to the gas station. He sometimes drank alone there. So I curled up on the couch and waited. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up in the morning to the sound of my uncle calling my name, asking what I was doing there. He was livid. I apologized and started gathering my things to leave when I noticed he was filthy. Dirt streaked his clothes, and there were 2 reddish stains on his face. I asked if he was okay, and then told him about the boy I'd seen in the woods. Something changed in his face when I said that. The anger drained, replaced by something that looked like fear. He grabbed my wrist and apologized for yelling. Then he offered to make me breakfast and asked me to tell him everything. I know what you might be thinking. That I must have been blind. That I ignored every warning sign. And you'd be right. I've thought the same thing 1,000 times. But you have to understand the circumstances. I was utterly isolated, and I had no friends. My uncle was the only person who listened to me, so I ignored the rest on purpose. That's why I blame myself for everything, because I know part of what happened was my fault for ignoring it. As I recounted what happened, I couldn't stop staring at the red marks on his face. He must have noticed, because halfway through my story, he got up to wash his face at the sink. When I finished, I asked him where he'd been the night before. He hesitated, just for a moment, like he was choosing his words carefully. Then he said he'd gone for a walk, returned around 11:30, saw me sleeping, and didn't want to wake me. But that wasn't true. I'd been awake well past midnight. I heard the door when he came in, and he looked like someone who hadn't slept at all. Still, I said nothing. I thanked him for letting me stay and said I should get home before my parents noticed I was gone. Before I left, he told me that if anyone asked, he'd been home all night. Once again, I nodded and left. I walked home with a massive knot in my throat. Even then, I knew something was terribly wrong, but I couldn't admit it. Not then, because without him, I'd have no one. The final straw came last year, when I stumbled upon a video on a YouTube channel. It was a true story submitted by someone, and it sent chills down my spine. It was about a boy who'd been chased through the woods, and the details were far too familiar. There was a description of a house that perfectly matched my uncle's, a section of forest near a creek that I recognized immediately. And most disturbingly, a birthmark on the boy's face, right above his brow. The exact same mark I had seen on the kid who'd begged me for help that night. The tone and the phrasing, the words used, it all felt so familiar. That's when it hit me. My uncle had submitted the story. I panicked because for the first time, there was something in me that I just couldn't ignore. Besides, I was an adult now. I knew just how wrong it all was. I called the police and did my best to explain everything. When I finished, the voice on the other end started laughing. It was a long, mocking laugh, the kind that turns your stomach. I had never felt so humiliated. The officer made a remark about kids with overactive imaginations, said I was probably snooping where I shouldn't be. Then he added that he knew my uncle and would talk to him. I said nothing after that. It was enough. I knew that if my uncle found out I knew and called the police, he'd lose control. I also knew that even if my family believed me, they would never admit it. They'd close ranks, support him over me. They'd cover it all up just to keep up appearances with the neighbors. In that moment, I realized there was only one thing I could do. Something I had wanted to do for years. I had to disappear. I went home, packed only what I needed to survive, and left. The rest isn't relevant here. Since then, I've contacted 2 newspapers, trying to get this story out. Nothing came of it. I know no one will take me seriously until I have concrete proof, and that's what I'm going to get. I won't rest until I uncover everything that happened, right under my nose. I know the odds of my uncle reading this are slim, but not impossible. After all, he submitted a story too, and the odds of me seeing and recognizing it were close to 0. Yet, here we are. So just in case he does see this, and now I'm speaking directly to him, I'm coming for you. Growing up in the Appalachian Mountains does something to your brain. I'm not even trying to be mysterious or make it sound deeper than it is. That's just the plain truth. And anyone who's lived here, or even just spent some time out in these parts, knows exactly what I'm talking about. You grow up with this constant feeling that you're just a small piece of something way bigger, and that there's a lot out there that most of us just don't understand. It's not a theory. It's just the way it is. I grew up in Tennessee, out in a remote area that backs up to one of the largest stretches of forest around. I was an only child, and since there weren't many other kids nearby, my parents used to invite my cousin, who was just 2 years older than me, to come spend the summer with us. I've got these bittersweet memories of those summers. On the one hand, I loved having someone around. And don't get me wrong, my cousin knows I love him like a brother. But on the other hand, he never really got these mountains, or the things that live in them. We both grew up hearing stories from my grandfather, who lived just a short drive from us. He used to sit us down out back at the end of the day, right behind his house, light up a little fire, and tell us stories. My cousin always laughed like it was some kind of joke, but I knew better. Those weren't just stories. I remember clear as day. We'd stay outside until 9 p.m. at the latest. After that, we were made to come in. When we started getting older, around our early teens, my cousin began pushing the rules. He'd tell me I was too scared of everything, said I was soft. I remember thinking it wasn't fear, it was being smart. I was smart enough to know there's more out here than just us. And sure, I had a rebellious streak too, but never with the woods. That's what I meant at the start. Folks who've lived here know how to act. They know what I mean. But I don't blame my cousin. He was just a city kid. To him, this was all one big adventure. At the end of the summer, he was going to go back to his parents' place in the city, and I was going to stay behind, living in those mountains. The summer it happened, we were 14. He'd been at our place for about 2 weeks when he told me he'd heard about some old abandoned buildings nearby. I'd heard about them at school, but I'd never gone out there. He kept going on about how he wanted to explore them, and even threw in that if I ever wanted to get a girlfriend, I needed to man up and stop being a chicken. Now that I'm older, I know how dumb that sounds. But back then, I was just a kid trying to prove something. He wore me down. So we packed a backpack with a few things and waited until around 11:30 p.m. When my folks were asleep, we slipped out the window. I was absolutely terrified. After about 20 minutes of walking in complete darkness, I told him I wanted to go back. But of course, he just kept pushing, saying we'd come this far, might as well keep going, and said I could go back alone if I wanted to. Honestly, I didn't even know which idea scared me more, continuing with him, or heading back by myself. So I stayed. Eventually, we found the first structure. It wasn't at all what I expected. I thought we'd find ruins, like old stone walls or something. But this place looked more like it had been abandoned maybe 50 years ago, tops. The first building was a chapel. Yeah, it was falling apart, but the walls and roof were still mostly intact. I told my cousin I wanted to go inside and check it out. He looked surprised, but the truth is, I wasn't feeling brave, not even close. I just didn't want to be standing out in the open woods anymore. At least the chapel had walls. He said cool, but he wanted to check out the other buildings first and would come meet me in a bit. That freaked me out, but I went in anyway. The place smelled awful, like heavy mildew, or maybe damp wood. It was hard to tell. I just remember thinking it was one of the worst smells I'd ever experienced. The chapel had 2 floors. I didn't know if the upper floor was safe to walk on, but even though the place was old, it looked kinda solid inside. So I went for it, 1 foot at a time, slowly up the stairs, listening to the wood creak under my weight. In that silence, that sound felt like it punched a hole right through my gut. When I got upstairs, I peeked out a window to try and spot my cousin. At first, it was just darkness. But then I saw a flashlight beam appear from behind this crumbling wall. He walked calmly, like nothing was wrong, and that helped me breathe a little easier, even though I was sure he had to be just as scared as me and was just better at hiding it. Just when I thought I couldn't be more freaked out, I saw something. I still don't know what it was. It looked like a person, maybe. Walking out there in the dark, sometimes stopping and just sitting in this weird, still way. Whatever it was, it looked like it was following my cousin. I didn't want to call out and draw attention to myself, but I also couldn't just let something happen to him. Then that figure sat again, slowly lifted its head, and I saw it. 2 eyes looking straight at me. Its mouth opened, and I saw these teeth glinting in the moonlight, forming a smile I'll never be able to describe. That's when I screamed his name and told him to run, yelling that there was a bear behind him. I took off, bolting down the stairs and out of the chapel, straight into the woods heading back toward the house. I could hear him running behind me, and I could feel that thing chasing us. He must have heard it too. His breathing was pure panic. When we finally got home, we were pounding on the front door like maniacs until my mom opened it with this horrified look on her face. As you'd expect, we were grounded for the rest of the summer. Every time I see my cousin now, he tells the story of how we survived a bear attack. I've never told him that the bear part was something I made up. That whatever I saw, it sure as hell wasn't a bear. If it had been a bear, we wouldn't have made it back. But the story didn't end that night. Whatever followed us through those woods, it followed us home. That same night, heart still racing so bad I thought it might give out. I looked out the window of my room, and there they were. Those same eyes, just at the edge of the trees watching me. I never told anyone. I should have, I know. But over the next few years, every now and then, I'd look outside and see it again. Just watching and ever coming closer. Never crossing that line. I still don't know what it was, or what it wanted. But I haven't seen it in about 7 years now. And I pray to God it stays that way. I'd like to share a series of events from my childhood that still don't make a lot of sense to me, even now. No one was ever caught, and nothing was ever officially explained. But what happened to my family in those years left scars we still carry. This all started sometime around the summer of 1995, when I was about 9 years old and my younger brother had just turned 5. That was also the year we lost our house in town. My dad had walked out when my brother was born. No note, no warning. Just gone. My mom, already struggling, got real sick not long after that. Something autoimmune. And the meds were too expensive. We couldn't afford to keep the house in Princeton anymore. So we packed up what we could and moved to the only place left. The old family house deep in the Appalachian woods, on land my grandparents had owned for decades, but hadn't touched in years. It was a rundown place, half-rotted porch, tin roof with holes, and a sagging barn that looked ready to collapse. But the land was huge, just forest as far as you could see, and my mom was always super resourceful. Yeah, it was an old house, but she was determined to make it livable and comfortable for us. Despite everything that happened, I was able to call that place home, and that's all thanks to my mom's inner strength. The view from any window in the house was both beautiful and absolutely terrifying, especially at night or on foggy days. Just dense, unbroken trees crawling up and down the hills. Our closest neighbors were over a mile down a gravel road that barely counted as drivable. You couldn't see another porch light from our windows, no matter the season. Just black trees and fog. At first, it felt like a fresh start. We planted a garden, and even though my mom was sick, she seemed more at peace out there. After all, it was the house she grew up in. But then, things started happening. It all began really small, easy to overlook. Though I could tell my mom was getting more tense and a lot more careful about keeping the house secure. Like waking up in the morning and finding every drawer in the kitchen open, even the ones jammed shut with paint and rust. But I really noticed a change in her behavior after my brother said there was a window monster that sometimes came to visit him at night. My mom didn't brush it off or say he was just imagining things like most parents would. She took it seriously. She moved him into my room, and from that night on, we started sleeping together. Years later, I found out she'd actually seen some dirt marks on his window, and even a footprint on the floor. A footprint way too small to be from an adult, but way too big to belong to my brother, or even me. She did her best to hide the worry, but sometimes I'd catch her lost in thought, just staring out at the woods with this look of pure fear on her face. About 2 months after my brother started sleeping in my room, I started noticing sounds at night. Footsteps on the gravel around the house. I had already talked to my mom about it before, and she made me promise never to peek out the window. She said it was probably just an animal, and that I had nothing to worry about. The window was tightly shut, and nothing could get in. We were safe. But a week later, she moved all of us into her bedroom, and the 3 of us started sleeping there together. Then there were the symbols. One morning we woke up and found strange markings scratched into the front door. Circles with X's through them, like a twisted compass. A week later, they appeared again on the barn doors. Always the same shapes, always carved deeply into the wood like someone had taken their time. My mom painted over them, but they kept coming back. She started keeping a bat by her bed and nailed all the windows in the house shut. She never told us, but I knew she kept a gun in the room with us while we slept. She stopped letting us go outside alone, even during the day. We lived like that for years, trapped in fear. The police were called to the house more than once, but nothing ever came of it. I must have been around 14 when my mom sat me down in the living room to talk. My brother was at school, and she took the chance to tell me that we were being stalked, and we needed to be extremely careful. She didn't want me to live in fear, just be cautious. Even though we knew we had a stalker, that someone was always outside our house in the middle of the night, nothing serious ever happened. Until one night that things escalated. It was late, after midnight, and I was still up reading with a flashlight under my blanket. Even though we all slept in the same room, it had become comfortable, and each of us had our own bed. The room we all slept in faced the front of the house, with a window right above the front porch. The first sign was the floor creaking. Then again. I was absolutely sure someone was walking up there. My mom, who by that point barely slept, woke up immediately and motioned for me to stay quiet. Right after that, we heard knocks on the front door. We both just stared at each other. Frozen. No reaction. Then we heard it. Someone trying to break down the front door. That was the last straw. My mom quietly motioned for me to wake up my brother, doing her best to keep him calm. Then she signaled for us to follow her as she dialed the police. There was a storage room in the house, one we rarely ever went into because it had never been fixed up. In the ceiling of that room, there was a small hatch that led to a narrow crawl space. It was technically an attic, but it was so cramped it could barely fit the 3 of us. Still, if someone managed to break in before the police arrived, at least we'd be hidden. My mom lifted us up first, then climbed in herself, pulled up the ladder, and shut the hatch, just in time. Seconds later, we heard the front door give in. It was pitch black in that crawl space, full of spiders, probably worse things too. But none of it compared to whatever had just forced its way into our home. My mom whispered as quietly as she could, telling us that no matter what happened, we couldn't cry. We had to stay completely silent. We heard movement, footsteps around the house, the floor creaking, doors opening. Whoever it was walked slowly, deliberately, not like they were in a rush. Almost like they didn't actually want to find us. They just wanted us to panic. The police arrived 19 minutes after we called. The longest, most terrifying 19 minutes of our lives. What saved us was the size of the house, the fact that the storage room was so old and untouched it was easy to overlook, and that whoever had broken in took their time. They weren't frantic. They walked with purpose. Steady. Calm. Like they were there to make a point, not to catch us. We left that same night. One of the officers, someone who had been to our house before, took pity on us and helped us relocate. We moved out of state, and with some support from the authorities, we managed to rebuild our lives. Years have passed since then. We still live together, the three of us, even though my brother and I are adults now. But those years of being stalked, isolated and living in fear, changed the way we see the world, changed how we trust people. And after everything our mom did for us, there's no way we're ever going to leave her alone.